In 1954, a church lady in rural Ohio fed 40 people. Easter dinner for $3.17. She knew tricks her grandmother brought from the old country, ways to stretch a dozen eggs into deviled eggs for the whole congregation, turn a sack of potatoes into creamy scalloped heaven, and make dessert from canned fruit and marshmallows. While city folks spent a week's wages on fancy Easter hams, she fed her church family on pennies using recipes passed down through generations. Today, most people think Easter dinner means expensive grocery bills and hours in the kitchen. The truth is smarter. These 30 forgotten church supper dishes cost almost nothing, fed crowds, and tasted better than anything you can buy at a restaurant. Real 1950s church ladies made things modern kitchens have forgotten. Hit subscribe and let's count down the 30 cheap Easter church suppers we still crave. Deviled eggs were the undisputed queen of every Easter table from the 1950s onward, appearing at church potlucks, family dinners, and holiday gatherings with such reliability that their absence would have been noticed and remarked upon. You took 1 dozen eggs, boiled them until the yolks were firm, peeled them carefully, sliced them in half lengthwise, and scooped the cooked yolks into a bowl. The yolks were mashed with mayonnaise, a spoonful of yellow mustard, a splash of vinegar, and salt and pepper until smooth and creamy. The mixture was spooned back into the hollow egg white halves, then sprinkled with paprika for color. The result was creamy, tangy, slightly rich, and universally beloved. A dozen eggs cost about 30 cents in 1954, making 2 dozen deviled egg halves that fed 12 people for pennies each. They were served cold on a special deviled egg plate, if you owned one, arranged in neat rows like little edible treasures. This was Easter itself on a plate. Scalloped potatoes were the side dish that appeared at every single church Easter dinner without fail, creamy and rich and comforting in a way that made people take second helpings even when they were already full. You took 5 or 6 large potatoes, peeled and sliced paper thin, layered them in a buttered baking dish with dots of butter between the layers, then poured a simple white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk over the top until the potatoes were nearly submerged. Salt and pepper seasoned each layer. The dish baked covered at 350 degrees for an hour, then uncovered for 15 more minutes until the top turned golden brown and the potatoes were fork tender. The result was creamy, buttery, and substantial enough to anchor an entire meal. A 5-pound bag of potatoes cost 40 cents and fed 15 people when prepared this way. This was the dish that proved potatoes could be elegant when treated with care and patience and real butter. Before we move on, many of you asked in the comments where to find these recipes. We even received tons of email too, so we published these recipes on our website. The link is in the description. Let's continue. Green bean casserole became so iconic in American cooking that it appeared at nearly every holiday table from Thanksgiving through Easter, a dish so beloved that Campbell's Soup Company still prints the recipe on their cream of mushroom soup cans today. You took 2 cans of cut green beans, drained thoroughly, and mixed them with 1 can of cream of mushroom soup and half a cup of milk, poured the mixture into a greased casserole dish, and topped it with canned French fried onions. It baked at 350 degrees for 25 minutes. Then you added more fried onions on top and baked for 5 more minutes until everything bubbled and the onions crisped. The result was creamy, savory, and had that perfect textural contrast between soft beans and crunchy onions. 2 cans of green beans cost 35 cents total, making this one of the cheapest dishes that still felt special and deliberate. This was the casserole that defined American church supper cooking. Roasted lamb with herbs was the traditional Easter main dish that symbolized spring, renewal, and religious significance in Christian households, though many families chose it simply because lamb was more affordable than beef and tasted incredible when roasted properly. You took a bone-in leg of lamb, rubbed it all over with olive oil, minced garlic, dried rosemary, dried thyme, salt, and black pepper, then roasted it at 325 degrees for about 20 minutes per pound until the internal temperature reached 145 degrees for medium rare. The result was tender, flavorful meat with a beautifully browned crust and juices that could be made into gravy. A small leg of lamb cost about $3 in 1954 and fed 8 to 10 people generously, making it cheaper per serving than a fancy ham. The leftover meat made sandwiches and shepherd's pie for days afterward. This was Easter dinner at its most traditional and most satisfying. Carrot cake with cream cheese frosting became the unofficial Easter dessert because of its connection to the Easter bunny, its moist texture, and its ability to feed a crowd for very little money. You grated fresh carrots fine, mixed them into a spiced cake batter made with flour, sugar, eggs, oil, cinnamon, and a touch of vanilla, then baked it in a rectangular pan at 350 degrees for 35 minutes. Once cooled, you spread a thick layer of cream cheese frosting made from cream cheese, butter, powdered sugar, and vanilla across the top. The result was incredibly moist, lightly spiced, and perfectly balanced between the cake's subtle sweetness and the frosting's tang. A pound of carrots cost 12 cents. I'm making an entire cake for under $1 that served 12 people easily. This was the cake that appeared at every Easter potluck, always on a special platter, always gone by the end of the meal. These first 5 Easter classics prove why 1950s church suppers were legendary. Deviled eggs, scalloped potatoes, green bean casserole, roasted lamb, carrot cake, every dish fed crowds for pennies and tasted like love. No shortcuts, no apologies, just food that brought people together. Ambrosia salad was the sweet, fruit-filled side dish that confused people who had never encountered it before because it walked the line between salad and dessert without committing to either category. You took canned mandarin oranges drained, canned pineapple chunks drained, miniature marshmallows, sweetened shredded coconut, and folded everything together with sour cream or Cool Whip. The mixture chilled in the refrigerator for at least 2 hours so the marshmallows could soften and the coconut could absorb the fruit juices. The result was sweet, creamy, tropical, and refreshing in a way that cut through the heaviness of rich main dishes. A large bowl cost about 75 cents to make and served 10 to 12 people easily. The name ambrosia referred to the food of the Greek gods, and church ladies who brought this to Easter potlucks felt that name was justified. This was the dish that kids requested specifically and adults ate while pretending they were just being polite. Glazed carrots were the spring vegetable dish that turned simple carrots into something elegant enough for Easter dinner through nothing more than butter, brown sugar, and careful timing. You took 2 pounds of carrots peeled and sliced into rounds, boiled them in salted water for about 8 minutes until just tender but not mushy, then drained them thoroughly. In the same pot, you melted butter with brown sugar until it bubbled, returned the carrots to the pot, and tossed them in the glaze until every piece was coated and glistening. The result was sweet, buttery, and had that perfect tender crisp texture that made vegetables actually appealing. 2 pounds of carrots cost 20 cents, and the butter and sugar added maybe another 15 cents, feeding 8 people for pennies per serving. This was the vegetable dish that even children ate without complaint, and the one that proved vegetables didn't have to be boring or bitter to be good. Mashed potatoes and gravy were the foundation of every substantial Easter dinner, the starchy base that soaked up meat juices and made people feel satisfied and full in a way that lighter foods never could. You boiled 5 pounds of peeled and quartered potatoes until fork tender, drained them, then mashed them with butter, warm milk, salt, and white pepper until smooth and creamy, but not gluey from overmixing. The gravy was made from the drippings of whatever meat you had roasted, thickened with flour, and enriched with more milk or broth. The result was rich, comforting, and essential. 5 pounds of potatoes cost about 35 cents and made enough mashed potatoes to feed 12 to 15 people generously. The gravy cost almost nothing since it was made from drippings that would otherwise be discarded. This was the dish that anchored the meal, the one that made everything else taste better, the one that people remembered eating at their grandmother's table. Roasted whole chicken was the budget-friendly alternative to expensive lamb or turkey, a practical choice for families who wanted a proper Easter main dish without spending a week's wages on meat. You took a whole chicken, patted it dry, rubbed it inside and out with softened butter, salt, pepper, and dried herbs, then roasted it at 375 degrees for about 20 minutes per pound until the skin turned golden brown and crispy and the internal temperature reached 165 degrees. The result was juicy, flavorful meat and a carcass that could be boiled into soup stock afterward. A whole chicken cost about 90 cents in 1954 and fed 6 to 8 people, making it one of the most economical proteins available. The leftover meat became chicken salad sandwiches, chicken pot pie, and chicken noodle soup throughout the week. This was smart cooking that wasted nothing and fed families well. Hot cross buns were the traditional Easter bread marked with a cross on top to symbolize the crucifixion, sweet and spiced and filled with raisins or currants that burst with flavor in every bite. You made a yeast dough enriched with milk, butter, eggs, and sugar, mixed in cinnamon, nutmeg, and dried fruit, let it rise until doubled, shaped it into individual buns, let them rise again, then baked them at 375 degrees until golden brown. After baking, you piped a white icing cross on top of each bun. The result was soft, slightly sweet, aromatic, and special enough to feel like a treat. A batch of 24 buns cost about $1 to make and could be served for Easter breakfast or as a dessert alongside coffee. These buns were so traditional that children sang nursery rhymes about them, and their absence from an Easter table would have been noticed immediately. These 10 Easter classics show why 1950s church suppers were unforgettable. Ambrosia salad, glazed carrots, mashed potatoes, roasted chicken, hot cross buns. Every dish was made with love and served with pride. No expensive ingredients needed. Just skill, tradition, and care. Mac and cheese casserole was the dish that every single child at the Easter table looked forward to, a creamy, cheesy, comforting side dish that adults also secretly loved even though they pretended it was just for the kids. You took 1 pound of dried elbow macaroni and boiled it in salted water until just tender but not mushy, drained it thoroughly in a colander, then mixed it with a cheese sauce made from butter, flour, milk, and 3 full cups of shredded sharp cheddar cheese, stirred together on the stovetop until smooth and velvety. The macaroni and cheese sauce went into a greased baking dish, topped with extra shredded cheese and a handful of buttered breadcrumbs for texture, then baked uncovered at 350 degrees for 25 minutes until the top turned golden brown and crispy and the edges bubbled enthusiastically. The result was rich, creamy, satisfying, and universally beloved by everyone from age 3 to age 83. A pound of macaroni cost about 15 cents in 1954, and the cheese added another 75 cents, making an entire casserole that fed 10 to 12 people for under $1 total. This was the dish that disappeared fastest at church potlucks, always scraped completely clean with nothing left in the pan except a few crusty cheese bits that people fought over. This was comfort food at its absolute finest, the kind of dish that made Easter dinner feel complete. Dinner rolls were the soft, buttery, pillowy bread that appeared in a cloth-lined basket at every Easter table, warm from the oven and practically begging to be torn apart and slathered with butter while steam still rose from the fluffy interior. You made a yeast dough from flour, milk, butter, sugar, eggs, and salt. I kneaded it until smooth and elastic, let it rise in a warm spot until doubled in size, punched it down, shaped it into golf ball-sized portions, arranged them touching each other in a greased baking pan, let them rise again until puffy, then baked them at 375 degrees for 15 to 18 minutes until golden brown on top. While still hot, you brushed the tops with melted butter so they glistened. The result was bread that was soft, slightly sweet, buttery, and absolutely irresistible. A batch of 24 rolls cost about 60 cents to make using basic pantry ingredients, and they were substantial enough that 2 rolls per person was plenty. Church ladies, who were known for their dinner rolls, guarded their recipes carefully and were always asked to bring bread to every single potluck and holiday gathering. These rolls were the kind of food that made people close their eyes and smile when they took the first bite, because good bread still warm from the oven was one of life's simple and perfect pleasures that money couldn't improve. Waldorf salad was the elegant fruit and nut salad that originated at New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel in the 1890s, but became a staple of American church suppers and Easter dinners by the 1950s because it was easy to make, looked impressive, and tasted refreshing alongside heavy main dishes. You took crisp apples cut into small cubes, celery diced fine for crunch, chopped walnuts for richness and texture, and sometimes raisins for sweetness, then tossed everything together with mayonnaise and a squeeze of lemon juice to prevent the apples from browning. The mixture chilled in the refrigerator for at least an hour before serving so the flavors could meld together. The result was crisp, creamy, sweet, and savory all at once, with every bite offering different textures from the crunchy celery and apples to the creamy dressing. A large bowl that served 8 to 10 people cost about 85 cents to make, with the walnuts being the most expensive ingredient at about 40 cents per cup. This salad was traditionally served on a bed of fresh lettuce leaves, making it look even more elegant and deliberate. The combination of fruit, nuts, and mayonnaise confused people who had never encountered it before, but one bite usually converted them into believers. This was the salad that church ladies made when they wanted to show a bit of sophistication and prove that budget cooking could still be beautiful and refined. 7-layer salad was the make-ahead dish that became famous at church potlucks because it looked stunning in a clear glass bowl where everyone could see all the distinct colorful layers stacked on top of each other like edible geology. You started with a layer of chopped iceberg lettuce at the bottom, then added layers of frozen peas, thawed, diced celery, diced hard-boiled eggs, shredded cheddar cheese, crumbled cooked bacon if you wanted meat or left it out for a vegetarian version, and finally a thick layer of mayonnaise spread across the top and sealed to the edges of the bowl to keep everything fresh. The salad was assembled the night before Easter and refrigerated overnight, then served cold the next day by scooping down through all the layers, so each serving got a bit of everything. The result was creamy from the mayonnaise, crunchy from the lettuce and celery, rich from the eggs and cheese, and satisfying in a way that made it more substantial than a typical green salad. The entire salad cost about $1.20 to make and served 12 to 15 people easily. Church ladies brought this in their largest glass bowls, specifically so people could admire the layers before it was served. The mayonnaise seal on top was controversial. Some people loved it, others thought it was too rich, but everyone agreed the salad was delicious once you mixed all the layers together on your plate. Potato salad was the essential Easter side dish that appeared at every single outdoor church picnic and holiday gathering throughout the 1950s, a dish so universally expected that its absence would have caused genuine confusion and disappointment. You boiled 5 pounds of potatoes in their skins until fork tender, let them cool just enough to handle, then peeled and cubed them into bite-sized pieces. While still slightly warm, you mixed the potatoes with diced hard-boiled eggs, finely chopped celery for crunch, minced onion for sharpness, sweet pickle relish for tang, and a dressing made from mayonnaise, yellow mustard, a splash of vinegar, salt, and black pepper. The salad was mixed gently so the potatoes didn't turn into mush, then refrigerated overnight so the flavors could develop and deepen. The result was creamy, tangy, slightly sweet, and absolutely essential to any proper Easter meal. 5 pounds of potatoes cost about 35 cents, and the other ingredients added maybe another 50 cents, making a huge bowl that fed 15 to 20 people for under $1 total. Every family had their own version with small variations. Some added paprika on top. Some used dill pickles instead of sweet. Some added a spoonful of sour cream to the dressing. But the basic formula remained the same across the entire country. This was the salad that tasted like summer picnics and family reunions and church gatherings under shade trees. These 15 Easter dishes prove why 1950s church suppers mattered. Mac and cheese, dinner rolls, Waldorf salad, 7-layer salad, potato salad. Every dish fed crowds for pennies and brought people together. No fancy ingredients, no complicated techniques, just good food made with care. Roasted asparagus was the elegant spring vegetable that signaled the arrival of Easter season because asparagus was one of the first fresh vegetables to appear in markets after the long winter months when nothing grew and everything came from cans or root cellars. You took 2 pounds of fresh asparagus spears, snapped off the tough woody ends at the natural breaking point where tender met, fibrous, arranged them in a single layer on a baking sheet, drizzled them with olive oil or melted butter, sprinkled them with salt and black pepper, and roasted them at 425 degrees for 12 to 15 minutes until they were tender but still had a slight bite and the tips had started to char and crisp slightly. The result was bright green, slightly sweet, nutty from the roasting, and far superior to boiled asparagus which turned gray and mushy and lost all its character. 2 pounds of fresh asparagus cost about 90 cents in season and served 8 people as a side dish, making it one of the more expensive vegetables on the Easter table, but worth every penny for its elegance and flavor. Some cooks squeezed fresh lemon juice over the roasted asparagus just before serving to add brightness, while others served it plain and let the natural flavor shine through. This was the vegetable that made Easter dinner feel special and seasonal and different from ordinary Sunday suppers, the one that reminded everyone that spring had finally arrived. Buttered corn was the simple, sweet, universally loved side dish that required almost no effort but delivered pure satisfaction to every person at the table, from the youngest child to the oldest grandmother. You took frozen corn kernels or canned corn drained, heated them in a pot on the stovetop with a generous amount of butter, salt, and a tiny pinch of sugar to enhance the natural sweetness, stirred everything together until the butter melted and coated every kernel, then served it hot in a serving bowl. The result was sweet, buttery, simple, and comforting in the way that only corn can be when it's cooked properly and not overdone. A large bag of frozen corn cost about 30 cents and served 8 to 10 people, making it one of the absolute cheapest side dishes you could possibly serve while still having something that people actually enjoyed eating. Some cooks added a bit of black pepper or paprika for color and subtle flavor, while others kept it completely plain and let the natural sweetness of the corn speak for itself. This was the side dish that appeared at every meal where children were present, because kids universally loved corn and would eat it without complaint or negotiation. It was also the side dish that took up valuable real estate on crowded Easter buffet tables because everyone expected it to be there and noticed if it wasn't. Coleslaw was the crunchy, tangy, refreshing salad that provided textural contrast and acidity to cut through the richness of heavy main dishes and creamy casseroles, a dish that was so simple to make yet so essential to any proper Easter spread. You took half a head of green cabbage shredded as fine as you could manage with a sharp knife or a box grater, 2 medium carrots peeled and shredded, mixed them together in a large bowl, then tossed them with a dressing made from mayonnaise, white vinegar, a tablespoon of sugar, salt, and black pepper. The slaw had to sit in the refrigerator for at least 2 hours before serving so the cabbage could soften slightly and absorb the dressing, but it tasted even better if made the night before and allowed to marinate overnight. The result was crunchy, tangy, slightly sweet, and refreshing in a way that cleansed your palate between bites of richer foods. A head of cabbage cost about 15 cents, making an enormous bowl of coleslaw for under 50 cents total that served 12 to 15 people easily. Some regional variations added crushed pineapple for sweetness, celery seed for a distinctive flavor, or a touch of prepared mustard for sharpness, but the basic cabbage-carrot mayonnaise formula remained constant across the entire country. This was the salad that appeared at every church picnic and outdoor gathering because it held up well in warm weather and actually tasted better after sitting for a while. Sweet potato casserole was the Southern Easter tradition that walked the line between side dish and dessert. Topped with either marshmallows or a pecan streusel, depending on which part of the South your family came from, and it was so sweet and rich that some people genuinely could not decide whether to serve it alongside the main course or after the meal. You took 4 or 5 large sweet potatoes, baked them until soft, scooped out the flesh, and mashed it smooth with butter, brown sugar, milk, eggs, vanilla extract, cinnamon, and a pinch of nutmeg. The mixture went into a greased baking dish, and then came the controversial topping decision. Either a thick layer of miniature marshmallows that would puff up and turn golden brown, or a streusel made from butter, flour, brown sugar, and chopped pecans. Either way, it baked at 350 degrees for 30 minutes until the topping was golden and the filling was heated through and slightly puffed. The result was incredibly sweet, rich, almost dessert-like, and completely delicious. Sweet potatoes cost about 10 cents per pound, making the entire casserole for under $1, even with the expensive pecans. This was the dish that sparked passionate debates about which topping was correct, with marshmallow people and pecan people each convinced their version was the only authentic one, but everyone agreed that sweet potato casserole was essential to any proper Easter dinner. Jello salad was the colorful, jiggly, sweet side dish that confused modern palates but was absolutely beloved in 1950s America, appearing at every single church, potluck, and holiday gathering in bright jewel tones that made buffet tables look festive and cheerful. You dissolved a package of flavored gelatin, usually lime, strawberry, or orange, in boiling water according to the package directions, added cold water, then folded in canned fruit, cocktail-drained miniature marshmallows, and sometimes cottage cheese or Cool Whip, depending on whether you wanted it to be a salad or a dessert. The mixture poured into a decorative mold and chilled overnight until firm, then unmolded onto a lettuce-lined serving platter the next day. The result was sweet, fruity, jiggly, and impossible to describe to anyone who had never eaten it before. Church ladies competed to see who could make the most elaborate molded gelatin creation, with some versions having multiple colored layers, others having fruit suspended in perfect patterns, and the most ambitious ones being molded into decorative shapes like rings or fish. This was the dish that defined 1950s cooking in the American imagination, for better or worse. These 20 Easter classics show the genius of 1950s church cooking. Asparagus, corn, coleslaw, sweet potato casserole, jello salad, every dish was affordable, crowd-pleasing, and made with care. No expensive ingredients, no wasted effort, just food that brought communities together every single Easter. Lemon bars were the bright, tangy, sunshine yellow dessert that appeared at every Easter gathering throughout the 1950s because their vibrant color and fresh citrus flavor perfectly captured the spirit of spring after the long, dark winter months when fresh fruit was scarce, and everything on the table tasted heavy and preserved and monotonous. You started by making a simple shortbread crust from all-purpose flour, softened butter, powdered sugar, and a pinch of salt, mixing everything together with your hands or a pastry cutter until it formed coarse crumbs, then pressing it firmly and evenly into the bottom of a 9 by 13-inch baking pan and baking it at 350 degrees for about 20 minutes until it was just barely golden around the edges and set in the center, but not browned or crispy. While the crust baked and filled the kitchen with the smell of butter and sugar, you whisked together the lemon filling in a large bowl, eggs beaten until smooth, granulated white sugar, a few tablespoons of all-purpose flour to help the filling set properly, freshly squeezed lemon juice from 4 or 5 lemons depending on their size and juiciness, and finely grated lemon zest for extra citrus punch and bright yellow color. As soon as the shortbread crust came out of the oven and was still piping hot, you poured the lemon filling directly over it without waiting for it to cool, then immediately returned the pan to the oven for another 25 minutes until the filling had set completely, but still had a very slight jiggle in the center when you gently shook the pan from side to side. After cooling completely to room temperature on a wire rack for at least 2 hours, you dusted the entire top surface generously with powdered sugar sifted through a fine mesh strainer to create an even, snowy white layer, then cut the bars into neat squares or rectangles with a sharp knife wiped clean between cuts. The result was a dessert that had 3 distinct and perfect layers working together in harmony. A rich, buttery, crumbly shortbread base that provided structure and richness, a tangy and intensely lemony custard filling that made your mouth pucker slightly in the best possible way, and a sweet powdered sugar topping that balanced the tartness and added visual appeal. Pineapple upside-down cake was the dramatic and show-stopping dessert that church ladies made when they wanted to impress people and prove that budget baking could still be beautiful and elegant and worthy of serving to company on special occasions like Easter Sunday when the whole extended family gathered together around one table. You started by melting a generous amount of butter in the bottom of a cast-iron skillet or a round cake pan placed directly on the stove top over low heat, watching carefully to make sure it didn't brown or burn, then sprinkling brown sugar evenly over the melted butter and stirring it together briefly to create a thick, sticky, caramel-like layer that would become the glaze. Over this sweet butter-sugar mixture, you arranged canned pineapple rings that had been drained thoroughly in a decorative pattern across the entire bottom of the pan, usually with one ring in the center, and 6 or 7 rings arranged around it in a circle, then placed bright red maraschino cherries carefully in the center of each pineapple ring for color and visual interest and a touch of extra sweetness. Over this carefully arranged fruit layer, you poured a simple yellow cake batter made from all-purpose flour, granulated sugar, softened butter, eggs, whole milk, baking powder, vanilla extract, and a pinch of salt, spreading it gently and evenly with a spatula so you didn't disturb the carefully arranged fruit pattern underneath. The cake baked at 350 degrees for about 45 minutes until a toothpick inserted in the center came out clean, with no wet batter clinging to it, and the edges had started to pull away slightly from the sides of the pan. And the top had turned golden brown and slightly domed. The truly dramatic moment that made this cake special came when you placed a large serving platter upside down over the hot cake pan immediately after removing it from the oven, then flipped the entire thing over in one confident, committed motion, letting gravity and physics do their work as the cake released from the pan and landed fruit side up on the platter, with the beautiful caramelized pineapple and cherry pattern that had been hidden on the bottom now displayed prominently on top for everyone to admire. Angel food cake was the light, airy, cloud-like dessert that earned its heavenly name from its pure white color, its delicate texture that seemed to dissolve on your tongue rather than requiring chewing, and the way it seemed to float on the plate rather than sit heavily like denser butter-based cakes made with egg yolks and solid fats. You made it by separating a dozen eggs very carefully so that not even a single speck of egg yolk contaminated the egg whites, because even the tiniest amount of fat from the yolks would prevent the whites from whipping up properly into the stiff peaks that gave angel food cake its characteristic texture and height. The egg whites went into a large, spotlessly clean mixing bowl, along with cream of tartar, which helped stabilize the foam and prevent it from deflating, and you beat them with a hand mixer or a stand mixer fitted with the whisk attachment until they formed stiff, glossy peaks that stood straight up when you lifted the beaters out of the bowl without drooping or falling over. Then came the tricky part that required a gentle hand and some patience. You sifted cake flour and granulated sugar together several times to make sure they were thoroughly combined and completely lump-free. Then folded this dry mixture into the beaten egg whites in several small additions, using a large rubber spatula and a gentle folding motion that cut down through the center of the mixture, swept across the bottom of the bowl, and brought the spatula back up along the side, rotating the bowl slightly after each fold. The goal was to incorporate the flour and sugar completely without deflating all those precious air bubbles you had just beaten into the egg whites, which took a light touch and some practice to get right. Vanilla extract and a tiny pinch of salt were folded in at the very end. The batter went into a 10-inch tube pan with a removable bottom that had been left completely ungreased. Greasing the pan would prevent the delicate batter from climbing up the sides as it baked, resulting in a flat, dense cake instead of a tall, fluffy one, and baked at 325 degrees for about 45 to 50 minutes, until the top was golden brown and sprang back when lightly touched with your fingertip. Coconut cake was the towering snow-white layer cake that appeared at Easter tables across the South, and became so strongly associated with the holiday that many Southern families wouldn't dream of celebrating Easter without it sitting proudly in the center of the dessert table where everyone could admire it before the first slice was cut. You baked 2 or 3 layers of simple white cake made from all-purpose flour, granulated sugar, softened butter, eggs, whole milk, baking powder, vanilla extract, and a generous pinch of salt. dividing the batter evenly between 2 or 3 round cake pans that had been greased and floured to prevent sticking, then baking them at 350 degrees for about 25 to 30 minutes until a toothpick inserted in the center came out clean and the cakes had pulled away slightly from the sides of the pans. The layers needed to cool completely on wire racks before assembly, or the frosting would melt and slide off, so most bakers made the cakes the day before Easter and stored them wrapped in plastic wrap at room temperature overnight. The frosting was made by creaming softened butter with powdered sugar, or adding enough whole milk to reach a smooth, spreadable consistency that was thick enough to hold its shape but soft enough to spread easily without tearing the delicate cake layers, then flavoring it generously with vanilla extract and a pinch of salt to balance the sweetness. To assemble the cake, you placed the first layer on a serving plate or cake stand, spread a thick layer of frosting across the top, but not the sides, placed the second layer on top of that, and pressed down gently to secure it, then spread frosting over that layer if you were making a 3-layer cake, or proceeded to frost the entire outside if you were making a 2-layer cake. The frosting needed to be spread thickly and generously all over the top and sides of the cake, using a spatula or butter knife to create a smooth surface that would hold the coconut. While the frosting was still soft and sticky and hadn't had time to form a crust, you pressed sweetened, shredded coconut all over the entire surface of the cake, starting at the bottom and working your way up, pressing handfuls of coconut firmly against the frosting so it would stick, and covering every single inch until no white frosting showed through and the cake looked like it had been completely encased in snow. Strawberry shortcake was the quintessential spring dessert that took full advantage of the first fresh strawberries of the season, those sweet, juicy, ruby-red berries that appeared in farmers' markets and roadside stands in late April and early May, just in time for Easter celebrations after a long winter of eating nothing but canned fruit and dried fruit and no fresh berries at all. You made tender, slightly sweet biscuits from all-purpose flour, granulated sugar, cold butter cut into small pieces, whole milk, baking powder, and a pinch of salt, using a pastry cutter or your fingertips to work the cold butter into the dry ingredients until the mixture resembled coarse crumbs, then stirring in just enough milk to bring the dough together into a shaggy mass that barely held together. The dough was patted out on a floured surface to about 3/4 of an inch thick, cut into rounds with a biscuit cutter or a drinking glass, placed on a baking sheet, brushed with a bit of milk or melted butter on top, then baked at 425 degrees for about 12 to 15 minutes, until they puffed up beautifully and turned golden brown on top, while remaining tender and fluffy inside, rather than dry and crumbly like a scone. While the biscuits baked and filled the kitchen with the smell of butter and baking powder, you sliced fresh strawberries that had been washed and hulled, tossed them with granulated sugar in a large bowl using about 1/4 cup of sugar for every quart of berries, then let them sit at room temperature for at least 30 minutes and up to 2 hours so the sugar could draw out the natural juices from the berries and create a sweet, syrupy liquid that would soak into the biscuits when assembled. You whipped cold, heavy cream straight from the refrigerator with a bit of sugar and vanilla extract, beating it with a hand mixer or a whisk until it formed soft peaks that held their shape when you lifted the beaters but weren't stiff or grainy or in danger of turning into butter. To assemble the shortcakes, you split each warm biscuit in half horizontally while it was still slightly warm from the oven, placed the bottom half on a plate, spooned a generous amount of strawberries and their accumulated syrup over it, letting the juice soak into the biscuit, added a large dollop of whipped cream, placed the top half of the biscuit on the cream at a slight angle so people could see all the layers, then finished with more strawberries piled on top and another generous dollop of whipped cream crowning the whole thing. These 25 Easter dishes prove why 1950s church suppers were unforgettable. Lemon bars, pineapple upside-down cake, angel food cake, coconut cake, strawberry shortcake. Every dessert was beautiful, delicious, and affordable. No fancy bakeries needed, just home cooks who knew how to make magic from simple ingredients. Lemon meringue pie was the impressive sky-high dessert that combined three distinct and technically challenging components: a flaky pastry crust, a tangy lemon custard filling, and a towering cloud of toasted meringue, into one spectacular pie that looked like something from a professional French bakery, but was actually made in home kitchens all across America by church ladies who had been practicing their meringue technique for decades and took great pride in creating perfectly tall, golden-peaked toppings that didn't weep or deflate. You started with a single 9-inch pie crust made from flour, cold butter or lard, ice water, and a pinch of salt, rolled out thin, pressed into a pie pan, crimped the edges decoratively, then blind-baked it by lining the raw crust with parchment paper or aluminum foil, filling it with dried beans or pie weights to prevent the bottom from puffing up, and baking it at 400 degrees for about 15 minutes until it was set and just beginning to turn golden. Then removing the weights and baking for another 5 to 7 minutes until the crust was completely golden brown and crisp so it wouldn't get soggy when the wet filling was added later. The lemon filling was made on the stovetop in a medium saucepan by whisking together granulated sugar, cornstarch, salt, and water until smooth with no lumps remaining. Then cooking the mixture over medium heat while stirring constantly until it came to a full rolling boil and thickened dramatically into a translucent gel. You then tempered the egg yolks by whisking a small amount of the hot sugar mixture into the beaten yolks to gradually raise their temperature without scrambling them, then whisking the warmed yolks back into the hot saucepan and cooking for another 2 minutes while stirring constantly. Off the heat, you stirred in butter until it melted completely, then added fresh lemon juice and finely grated lemon zest, stirring until everything was smooth and glossy and the filling smelled intensely of bright, tart lemons. This hot filling was poured immediately into the pre-baked pie shell and spread evenly with a spatula. The meringue topping required a completely clean, grease-free mixing bowl and spotlessly clean beaters, or you would never get the volume you needed. You beat egg whites with cream of tartar at medium speed until they became foamy. Then gradually added granulated sugar, 1 tablespoon at a time, while continuing to beat, increasing the speed to high once all the sugar was added, and beating until the meringue formed stiff, glossy peaks that stood straight up when you lifted the beaters and felt smooth rather than grainy when rubbed between your fingers. Rice pudding was the humble, comforting, old-fashioned dessert that turned leftover cooked rice into something sweet and creamy and satisfying, a dessert that was so simple and economical and resourceful that it appeared regularly on Easter dessert tables alongside much fancier cakes and pies, without anyone thinking twice about serving something made from leftovers and considering it good enough for company and special occasions. You took 2 cups of cooked white rice that was left over from yesterday's dinner, or cooked fresh if you didn't happen to have any leftovers sitting in the refrigerator, added it to a heavy-bottomed pot or saucepan along with whole milk, granulated sugar, a pinch of salt, and either a cinnamon stick or a generous sprinkling of ground cinnamon, depending on what you had available in your spice cabinet. Then set the pot over low heat on the stovetop and simmered everything together slowly and gently for about 30 to 40 minutes, stirring frequently with a wooden spoon to prevent the rice from sticking to the bottom of the pot and scorching, until the milk had been gradually absorbed by the rice and the mixture had thickened into a creamy, porridge-like pudding consistency that was soft and tender rather than thick and gluey. Some traditional cooks added raisins or dried currants about halfway through the cooking time for sweetness and textural interest and a bit of chewiness, while others preferred their rice pudding completely plain and simple so the delicate flavor of the rice and cinnamon could shine through without competition from other ingredients, and the most ambitious cooks stirred in beaten eggs at the very end of the cooking time to make the pudding even richer and more custard-like and luxurious in texture. The finished pudding could be served warm straight from the pot, which was how most people preferred it on cool spring evenings, or chilled completely in the refrigerator and served cold in individual glass bowls. The finished pudding could be served warm straight from the pot, which was how most people preferred it on cool spring evenings, or chilled completely in the refrigerator and served cold in individual glass bowls with an extra dusting of ground cinnamon sprinkled across the top for color and aroma. The result was a dessert that was sweet but not cloying, creamy and comforting, gently spiced with cinnamon that reminded you of your grandmother's kitchen, and filling in a way that made you feel satisfied and content rather than stuffed and uncomfortable. Bread pudding with vanilla sauce was the ultimate thrifty dessert that proved stale bread was never truly wasted or worthless, as long as you had eggs, milk, and a bit of sugar in the house. A dessert that could transform what would have been garbage headed for the trash can or the chicken coop into a warm, custardy, cinnamon-scented treat that people actually requested by name and looked forward to eating at Easter dinners and church suppers. You tore stale bread into rough chunks about an inch or two across. Any kind of bread worked, including white bread, whole wheat, French bread, or even leftover dinner rolls that had gone hard, and placed them in a greased baking dish, spreading them out evenly across the bottom. Then you poured over the bread a rich custard made from eggs beaten until smooth, whole milk, granulated sugar, vanilla extract, melted butter for richness, ground cinnamon for warmth and spice, and a pinch of nutmeg for depth and complexity. The bread needed to soak in this custard mixture for at least 20 minutes before baking, and preferably longer if you had the time, which allowed every piece of bread to become thoroughly saturated with the sweet, eggy liquid and swell up soft and tender rather than remaining dry and hard in the center. Some cooks gently pressed down on the bread with the back of a spoon every few minutes during the soaking time to make sure all the pieces were submerged and absorbing liquid evenly. The pudding baked uncovered at 350 degrees for about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the depth of your baking dish, until the top turned golden brown and slightly crispy, with some pieces of bread poking up above the surface and getting toasted and crunchy, while the interior remained soft and custardy and wobbly when you gently shook the pan, and the whole kitchen filled with the incredible aroma of cinnamon and vanilla and baking bread that made everyone's mouth water in anticipation. Sugar cookies, decorated with Easter eggs and bunnies, were the festive, colorful, fun dessert that children at Easter dinners looked forward to more than any other item on the crowded dessert table, not necessarily because they tasted better than the fancy layer cakes and fruit pies surrounding them, but because they were decorated in pastel colors with Easter-themed designs that made them feel special and celebratory and different from everyday cookies, and because children were usually allowed to choose their own cookie from the platter, which gave them a sense of agency and excitement. You made a simple sugar cookie dough from softened butter creamed together with granulated sugar until light and fluffy, then eggs beaten in one at a time, then vanilla extract for flavor, then all-purpose flour, baking powder, and a pinch of salt stirred in just until combined without overmixing, which would make the cookies tough. The dough needed to be chilled in the refrigerator for at least an hour, or even overnight to firm it up enough to roll out without sticking to everything. Then you rolled it out on a well-floured surface to about a quarter-inch thickness. Cut it into shapes using Easter-themed cookie cutters in the form of eggs, bunnies, chicks, crosses, lilies, and flowers, transferring the cut shapes carefully to a baking sheet lined with parchment paper. Then baking them at 350 degrees for about 8 to 10 minutes until they were just barely golden around the edges, but still pale and soft on top, so the colored frosting would show up brightly and clearly. Decorating them with royal icing or simple buttercream frosting that had been tinted with food coloring in pastel shades of pink, yellow, blue, green, and lavender, piping careful outlines around the edges of each cookie with a small pastry bag or a plastic sandwich bag with the corners snipped off. Some cookies got rainbow sprinkles scattered across the wet frosting. Some got coarse sugar crystals that sparkled in the light. Some got edible pearls or silver dragées for elegance. And some just got smooth, perfectly piped frosting that dried hard and glossy and looked professional. Lamb stew was the rustic, hearty, warming, one-pot meal that some families served as their Easter main course instead of an elegant roasted leg of lamb, particularly families with large households to feed, or families who preferred the economy and practicality of a stew that could simmer unattended on the back of the stove all afternoon, while everyone was at church services and be ready to eat piping hot the moment they walked back through the front door with hungry bellies and tired feet. You took cubed lamb, shoulder, or leg meat, cut into bite-sized pieces, patted it dry with paper towels so it would brown properly instead of steaming, then browned it in batches in a heavy-bottomed Dutch oven or soup pot with a bit of vegetable oil or lard over medium-high heat, turning the pieces with tongs to make sure all sides developed a deep golden brown crust that would add incredible flavor to the finished stew, then removed the browned meat to a plate and set it aside. In the same pot, without washing it, you added diced onions, carrots cut into thick rounds, and celery cut into chunks, sautéing them in the flavorful fat left behind from browning the meat and scraping up all the delicious caramelized brown bits stuck to the bottom of the pot with a wooden spoon, cooking the vegetables for about 5 minutes until they softened and started to release their moisture. The browned meat returned to the pot, along with potatoes cut into large chunks that would hold their shape during the long simmering time, fresh or dried rosemary and thyme for herbal depth, bay leaves for subtle complexity, salt and black pepper to taste, and enough water or beef broth or chicken broth to cover everything by about an inch. The pot was covered tightly with a lid and moved to a low simmer on the back burner or placed in a low oven at 300 degrees, where it cooked slowly and gently for about 2 full hours without anyone touching it or stirring it, allowing the lamb to become fall-apart tender and the vegetables to soften completely, and the broth to reduce slightly and thicken into a rich, flavorful gravy. Or some traditional cooks added frozen peas during the last 10 minutes of cooking for a pop of bright green color and a touch of sweetness, while others preferred to keep the stew simple and rustic with just meat, potatoes, carrots, and onions without any other embellishments. These 30 Easter church suppers prove that 1950s families didn't need expensive grocery bills or complicated recipes to celebrate the holiest Sunday of the year. They needed faith, community, and a long folding table covered in deviled eggs, scalloped potatoes, green bean casserole, roasted lamb, carrot cake, and ambrosia salad. These weren't fancy restaurant meals. They were home-cooked dishes made from pantry staples, canned goods, day-old bread, and whatever the butcher had on sale that week. A whole Easter dinner cost less than a single restaurant entree costs today. We live in a world of meal kits, on takeout apps and grocery bills that make us cry at the checkout counter. These 30 dishes remind us that real celebration doesn't require wealth. It requires heart, a hot oven, and the courage to share what we have with the people we love. Our grandparents fed entire congregations for pennies. We can do the same. The seniors who cooked these meals are mostly gone now, but their recipes remain, written in faded ink on church cookbook pages, penciled into spiral notebooks, and remembered by the grandchildren who sat at those long folding tables and ate until their bellies were full and their hearts were warm. Which of these 30 Easter dishes will you make this year? Drop the number in the comments below and tell us if your grandmother made any of these classics. Share this with someone planning Easter dinner on a budget. Let's bring these forgotten church suppers back where they belong, on our tables, in our kitchens, feeding our families with love, faith, and pennies.